So this is our last session in this workshop series. We started in September the 12th. It's hard to believe it's December the 12th. So thank you to everyone who's sort of stayed with us all the way. And just a reminder that you can look at all of the previous episodes and sessions on our website. I want to do a land acknowledgement. We pay respect to the Algonquin people, who are the traditional guardians of this land. We acknowledge their long-standing relationship with this territory, which remains unceded. We pay respect to all Indigenous people in this region, from all nations across Canada, who call Ottawa home. We acknowledge the traditional knowledge keepers, both young and old, and we honor their courageous leaders, past, present, and future. And if anybody feels they want to add their land acknowledgement, just feel free to do that in the chat. We're still very keen to have data champions join us. We have some data champions, but we are looking for lots more. And so if we can entice you, please go and have a look at this URL about the data champions in Ottawa. That would be much appreciated. And today we had a great discussion before 10 o'clock. And it's my pleasure to introduce Professor Kayte Spector-Bagdady, who is going to speak on patient preferences for data sharing privacy considerations at the intersection of law and health. And so I'm going to stop sharing mine, and Kayte, you can start to populate yours. And
sure,
turn the session over to you, of course.
Just give me 1 second. Okay, is everybody looking at the correct screen?
Yes, that looks excellent. Thank you.
Perfect. And this is not a huge group, and I know that you guys have access to your mics and video, so feel free to stop me at any point if anybody wants to chime in or compare the US experience to the Canadian experience, or just any questions as we go is fine with me too. Okay, so thank you so much for that introduction. And yeah, so today I'm going to be talking about, as was introduced, patient preferences for data sharing and privacy considerations, but also some of the legal structures that we have in the US that sort of influence how patients can express those preferences and whether they get the option to express them. I just want to thank my funders, NIH. I have a current K01, which is our Career Development Award from NHGRI, focusing on genetic data sharing between academics and private industry. And then NCATS, our Translational Science Institute, recently got a grant focusing on hospitals sharing patient data with commercial entities. So looking forward to launching that as well. So here's an overview of the things I'm going to cover in the next 35 minutes or so. First, I'm going to talk a little bit about the promise of big data research, although I'm going to just do that very briefly because I assume that everybody is here because they believe in the promise of big data research. I'm going to talk about some challenges to equitable access to that promise, what happens. I'm going to then talk about the implications of not resolving those challenges, because I think sort of too often we ignore that component of sort of the policy spectrum. We say, hey, here are some problems, but we never sort of think through all of the different implications of those problems and what that means for people, which I think is very helpful in making the policy argument that we should resolve those challenges. And then a few ideas on how to improve the system. So first, as to the promise of big data research, sort of this was launched intentionally in the US around 2013 or so, between 2011, like right at the beginning of the Obama administration, his first term. And he funded so I sort of got interested in this because I was the associate director for Obama's Bioethics Commission for 5 years. And it was all part of this push to fund and launch this new database and this new approach that would, the goal of this database was to be extremely diverse and include historically excluded communities across the demographic spectrum, such that research using these data would either generalize to historically excluded communities or specifically focus on historically excluded communities. And so that was sort of where we all started, sort of the promise that we were going to be able to make health, precision health, and sort of tailored to people's genetic variants and their health behavior, and be able to predict people's health outcomes with different health interventions. So that was sort of the promise. That's a very high level slide of a huge topic, but I assume that's what you guys have the most background on. So I'm just going to sort of blow through that. And then I'm going to focus a little bit more on challenges to equitable access to this promise. So why aren't we actually achieving that goal yet? First, I'll talk about the law. So I'm a lawyer and a bioethicist by training. And so I think that this intersection between bioethics and the law is particularly fascinating. So in the US, we regulate data in silos based on how the health data or specimens came into the research system to begin with, and who's controlling those data and specimens. So for patient data, for clinical data, it's largely regulated by HIPAA in the US. And then for research data that comes in through federally funded research or comes in through, you know, almost any kind of academic research, because many of our institutions apply the same rules to the technically federally funded researchers that they do the non-federally funded researchers. So at the University of Michigan, it doesn't matter whether you're working with federal funding or not, you have to follow these government rules. And that's true at most of the major research institutes here. And that's generally called the common rule or the human subjects research regulations. We have some under FDA, and we also have some under 17 other departments and agencies, but they're substantially similar. And then commercial data is sort of this big, vast, gapping hole in our regulatory system because it was not envisioned in the 1980s or 90s, which is when we wrote the research regulations and the patient-facing regulations. Nobody was looking towards commercial data because how would commercial entities have health data to begin with, right? Like that was not a thing in the 1980s and 90s. And so we sort of like back of the envelope have tried to regulate some commercial data. It's not going very well. There's a lot of bills in Congress right now considering how to do it better, but just it's good to know that data are regulated by how they come in. And the challenge, of course, with that, among many things, is that data don't stay where they were originally collected, right? Like that's the whole point of data sharing. That's the whole point of these enforced mandates to ensure that we're collecting all these data, we're sharing these data. Data are going everywhere, right? Health information is no longer written down on your medical record. I'm old enough that my first job in a hospital, part of my job was when patients checked in was to reach back and grab their medical record off the shelf to hand to them to walk into the office. That's not the way it's done anymore. And increasingly, data and specimens are being shared between these three silos. So hospitals are being asked by commercial entities all the time to share patient and research data. I'm actually on an entire committee at the University of Michigan, and that's like what the committee was put together to do, is to review these requests. Also, we know that academics, at least in the genetics world, are increasingly using private genetic data for their peer-reviewed research. This is a little dated, but I had a student this summer sort of update this chart, and the ratio is still going up. And also we know that in the commercial world, commercial industry is increasingly gathering health and health proxy data from all sorts of places. So from wearables, fitness devices, period trackers, wellness things, weight trackers, anywhere where people are inputting their health information themselves, or sort of self-commercializing their data, as well as all that data that's out there that can be bought and sold between companies. And this article was about an entire company that their entire business model is to collect health and health proxy data that's out there on the market and reassemble it together into what very closely represents, one person's medical record. A huge part of this is geolocation data, as an example. So if I travel every day from my office at the end of the day to the bar, that could give you some important information about my health. Other things that happen that people don't even think, people think of themselves, their own data in silos, because that's the way they're structured. But, so you might be having one kind of geolocation data shared, and you might be sharing personal information on Facebook and professional information on Twitter and dating information on Hinge, and people are not thinking about these professional companies that are actually buying up all that data and putting it together in what ends up being like a very specific and in-depth and detailed description of you and your actions. The other thing to point out under our human subjects research regulations and our data regulations is that it doesn't actually cover all human subjects research in the US. It only covers research in 3 circumstances. So these protections, which include informed consent and IRB review, only apply, I mentioned this a little bit, but if you're using federal funding, so if you have NIH funding or something like that, if an institution like the University of Michigan voluntarily decides to extend all of these regulations to all of the research at the institution, no matter what, and again, most major academic centers in the US do that, or if you have some sort of contact with FDA, right? So if you're studying a drug for a separate indication, so you're using it off label, or you're studying a new drug or device, or you're submitting your data in support of a new drug or device or biologic application to FDA, if you're doing anything that involves FDA, FDA is also going to ensure that you followed human subjects research regulations, but it doesn't cover quite everything. The other thing is that we're still built on a structure where we only regulate identifiable research in both HIPAA and under the human subjects research regulations. We're only talking about identifiable research, which we define as sort of those 18 HIPAA identifiers, which we now know and have known, frankly, for probably 15 years. It's totally inadequate to actually protect the identity of the individual when you have all this information about them. So I'm the only person who goes from my house to my office to pick up my kids from their school back to my house. And if you have that geolocation data of where my iPhone is going, and then you have all the other data that I'm punching into my iPhone as I do that, even though it's technically de-identified, there's a lot of information about me. And then also, this is something that patients don't realize, and they get extremely uncomfortable when we tell them, is that researchers can use fully identified health information and biospecimens without any sort of additional patient consent or participant consent, as long as we get an IRB waiver. So we can just write to the IRB and say, hey, we'd like to conduct some really low risk research just with data, non-interventional. And we can just do that with permission from the IRB. So that was the one major challenge, is looking at the law. And then the second major challenge I'll talk about briefly is disparities in access to care and in access to research and in access to research results, which is also a gigantic topic, but we'll just cover it briefly so we're all on the same page. So there's lots of different disparities and differences in access to health and research and improved health outcomes. I'll highlight 3 here. One is that there are disparities, as you know, for access to clinical care and diagnostic testing. And why that is relevant to this talk is because that's where a lot of our research data are generated, right? People who can come into the hospital and be part of our AI algorithms. People who can afford to pay for genetic testing or can afford to pay for insurance, right? Because we're not Canada. And so you have to be able to have the money in order to have access to these data banks to begin with. Second, there are disparities in participants who are recruited for research, either for intentional or non-intentional or bigoted or systemic ways. There are disparities for who's recruited. And then there's differences by demographics in the types of participants that are more or less likely to consent to research. So I'm going to focus on the second two parts of these for the next few minutes, because that's my area of expertise. And I'm going to use the University of Michigan as an example. I will say that this is true across universities, but this is where we took a deep dive because we're here. And this is an assessment of the University of Michigan's own Michigan Genomics Initiative, where we're asking patients and research participants to consent to have their specimen and their health information linked and put in our research data so others can do research with it. And what we found, first of all, was that there were differences in participants who were recruited to enroll in our MGI databank. So that top line there is all Michigan medicine patients that are coming in to begin with. As you see, we are a largely white population at baseline. But if we're talking about patients that were recruited for the MGI database, we were statistically significantly more likely to recruit white patients rather than historically excluded patients. And this is imperfect data, and I'll get to sort of the final published data in a second, but I do like this visual because I think it sets up nicely this tension between autonomy, right? So we talk about autonomy so much in research and saying, you know, what are patients' preferences? So in one way, it's really respectful of individuals' autonomy to ask them specifically whether they would like to enroll in research and be part of this research. That sounds really good. That sounds like something a bioethicist should be saying, right? We should be asking people and honoring their autonomy. But this also sets up this inherent tension between autonomy and sort of the justice conceptualization of the generalizability of our research. So restated, if we have more demographically diverse databases, our research is more likely to be generalizable or targeted for historically excluded communities. But it sort of sets up this inherent tension between, well, when we ask people, what we find is historically excluded communities, for rightful reasons, continue to historically exclude themselves because of all of this background. And so is this inherent tension between justice and autonomy, justice and respect for persons, and how do we resolve it? And because what we found, so this is the more specific published final piece that ended up in the paper, but what we found is we were more likely to recruit older, non-Hispanic whites, men. And there was a lot of conversation, as you can imagine, about why that was. And so we did a lot of looking back at the data and trying to figure out, because this was all retrospective, so trying to figure out what we had already captured that could help us answer this question. And what we found by and large, what we were able to capture is really the most impactful problem was that we were recruiting in pre-op. So we were recruiting patients who were waiting for an operation, which made a lot of sense from the perspective of that they were already donating a blood specimen, so they didn't have to come back. They didn't have to have an additional needle prick. But the people sitting in pre-op at the University of Michigan were more likely to be older white men, because unless you're going in for a trauma surgery, which we wouldn't have time to recruit you for MGI anyway, you have to have insurance in order to have any sort of elective surgery. So that's why in our population, those were older white men. But then here's the other rub is we also found that our Black or African American, Asian, or Hispanic patients were almost twice as likely not to consent once they were approached, right? So that bottleneck happened twice and happened in the same direction as we continue to exclude historically excluded communities. So what are some of the implications? So we saw from like the legal perspective and from the health disparities perspective, some of the problems that are occurring. So like if we actually go through and we roll it out, what are the implications of not resolving some of these challenges? So first I'll say, and as I'm sure you've realize it is sort of like the worst kept secret in research is informed consent doesn't actually inform people in the way that we aspire or assume it does in research. Research by Bescow et al. Has found time and again that actually the most impactful form of informed consent is the conversation. Like that's what people actually remember. That's what people can reiterate. However, all of our regulations focus on what's on the informed consent form. And when we're like, yeah, you should have a conversation, and that's basically all the regs say, but then all of these different things have to be included on the form. And one of the policy reasons for that is it's easy to regulate a form. Like I can put all these things on a piece of paper and I can submit it to NIH, and NIH can be like, yes, check, 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 check. You put all the things on the form you're supposed to, and you handed it to the patient, and the patient signed it. However, how do we regulate a conversation? How do we ensure that the right conversation happened? And so it's this ironic tension that the most effective way to do informed consent is something that's entirely unregulated, besides saying we should have informed consent. And that was sort of one of the things we found in this roundabout way by this research. And I had actually originally designed it because I wanted to talk to patients about data commercialization, and if their data were to be commercialized, which we know that most people object to, what different kinds of ways could we use the funding that would once again reenact people's altruistic intentions to support research, right? So the interview guide, we were going to go in and say, well, what if we use the money to support research generally? What if we use the money to support the research for the disease or disorder that you're in the hospital for? What if we use the money and donate it to the football team, which you might laugh, but is actually a really big deal at the University of Michigan. Many people are very pro the football team. So that was the intent of the research. But even though our new our updated 2018 human subjects research regulation specifically requires, so this is a snapshot of the regulation, that we have to disclose if we might make commercial profit off of research data. And this is a section from our informed consent form that did specifically disclose above and beyond what's required from the regulations about all of the things that we did to commercialize. When we walked in and started asking people how we could use the money from commercialization of their data, every single one of them said something along the lines of, wait, what? You're commercializing my data? People threatened to call their lawyers. My poor research associate came out of the room the first time and called me and was like, Professor Spector, we've got a problem. They're threatening to sue me because we're commercializing their data, which of course they fully consented to, but nobody had any idea. And the funny thing about this is that we did sort of we did paired interviews both with patients and their cancer doctor, who was referring them into the research protocol. So this was patients with cancer that caused tumors, and their tumors were being sent to our precision medicine lab to sequence the tumors. So the cancer doctors were most likely not involved in the research. And both the patients were confused, but then their cancer doctor was also confused and said, wait, what? You're commercializing my patient's data? You better not sell it to 23andMe. I would think you'd need consent for that. Which was interesting because, of course, we had followed all the regulations, gone above and beyond, and still nobody had any idea what we were talking about. So people don't understand. Legal implication too is all of our metrics for regulation are things that are not important to people. So, for example, in this research, we found that the majority of people we asked were not comfortable with universities using specimens and commercializing specimens. And also that even though the vast majority of our patients were favorable to data sharing, they didn't see that as an obligation to participate in research, which is interesting from an ethical standpoint, because Faden et al. And other sort of ethical arguments for this virtuous circle of the learning health system, where patients come in, they receive care, they contribute their data, which then goes to research, which then goes to improve care that they will benefit from in the future or have already benefited from. This sort of idea that there's this cyclical ethical obligation. Patients generally don't agree with that. They think you should specifically ask them. In another recent piece, we also found that people, and this is asking about what they would want to be notified about, people are more likely to want to be notified about commercial use of their data. So if hospitals are sharing it with commercial entities as opposed to university researchers, this is self-evident, but people are more concerned about identified data and specimens than de-identified. And interestingly, even though our human subjects research regulations are more protective of biospecimens than data, I think by and large, due to the Henrietta Lacks book and the Henrietta Lacks narrative, which, you know, I'd be really interested in discussing after if people are interested in discussing that. We as a government are more protective of specimens than data, but in this recent survey with over 2,000 people representative of the US population, we actually found that people are more concerned about notice of use of their health information versus specimens. And one last slide, just because we're focusing on patient preferences. There's a ton of great research in this area, but my mentor, Dr. Reshma Jaxi, you know, has found that people want specific research consent. Again, differences along self-identified race and ethnicity. And this bottom one, I think, is particularly interesting by Ray DeVries et al. But they found that when they asked patients whether they're willing to blanket consent for use of their data and specimens for research, the vast majority of them said, yeah, that's totally fine. We're willing to blanket consent. But then when they went back again and they asked more specific questions when they were like, well, what if we're going to use it to improve weapons of mass destruction? What if we are going to use it to improve medications for abortion? Other sort of controversial topics, what they found was, again, the majority who had already consented said, oh, wait, no, I hadn't really thought about it. I don't want to contribute to that. And they called that a non-welfare interest, right? This idea, because in the legal system, we really can only compensate people for, you know, property damage or financial damage. Like that's the kind of thing you can give back to people. But this idea that using your data or specimens in ways that you wouldn't have preferred is some sort of dignitary harm, right? It's embarrassing, or it's not in line with your value system in a way that makes people uncomfortable. So remember, the first implication was people don't understand the informed consent forms. The second implication was even if they understood the informed consent forms, we're regulating it in a way that doesn't align with people's values. And then the third implication I'm going to talk about is that it really allows for the privatization of what otherwise, I would argue, should be this common good, this commonly held good of data for research. And this is this very weird quirk of how the US regulates data, health data, is that we regulate the heck out of clinical data and research data. But private data is really allowed to do its entirely own thing, commercial companies. And we're actually like in a cycle now where commercial companies are collecting all of this health information, de-identifying it, and then selling it back to academic researchers for their work. And academic researchers are getting access to this data, which they couldn't have collected or used legally in the first place. And, you know, the All of Us research program and their data bank, which, you know, I very much support the goals. They've achieved 80% representation of historically excluded communities. But they're at about 350,000 fully signed up people, whereas, you know, as an example, 23andMe has over 12 million participants with millions and millions of different phenotypic data points in addition to the genetic ones. And so there's just really no way for the government databases to catch up to the private ones at this point. And, you know, sometimes I get the question of, well, what's the problem with that? Isn't that the market? Isn't that democracy in action, right? Isn't that the way it's supposed to work? If private companies can do it better, shouldn't private companies hold this common resource? And so I'll give you a couple of examples of why we shouldn't just say, well, private companies should control all of the health data in the US. First, this gives industry a gatekeeping function over what research is enabled. So for example, 23andMe, researchers have to apply to have access to that data set, and 23andMe, and they're transparent about this, but they make the decision to support research that's in line with their values. And we know that there's a lot of biases when industry and pharmaceutical industry and drug manufacturers get to pick which data to publish and which data to support. Second, it limits the ability of other researchers to validate the work or build derivative discoveries upon that data. Because say I'm a federally funded researcher and I want to use a 23andMe data bank, what I do is I sort of plug in my research questions, and what I get back is aggregate data in response to my research questions. I don't get the individual level data, nor am I allowed through data use agreements to share individual level data to the government data banks that I would otherwise be obligated to contribute to under our data sharing rules. And so that prevents anybody trying to validate or build upon the research that I've published in the peer review literature. And then also private companies change hands, right? So even if you feel really good about the 23andMe CEO right now, who's been CEO the entire time, these things swap hands all the time. And those are 3 pictures of data sets that have recently swapped hands. GED match was originally sort of privately but small, held by a couple of guys in a garage. That was then used to identify the Golden State Killer in the US, who killed and raped and murdered many, many women. But there was a lot of controversy about this because the police force, what they did was they collected a sample legally. So they collected a sample from the trash of somebody who was suspected to be the killer, which is legal under US criminal law. But then they submitted it to GED match as just like a regular consumer. And they didn't identify that they were law enforcement, that they were looking for relatives of the person who'd committed this crime. And there was a lot of backlash against GED match. People were really upset that the data had been used for commercialization. So GED match said, well, okay, now you all know that we're going to use your data for law enforcement purposes. And if you don't like it, you can get out. And people were still really upset. And so GED match just ended up selling themselves to a forensic data company. So now that's the main goal of the database, is for officers to use for law enforcement purposes. And Meredith is another company that just announced that I don't know how familiar you guys are with IBM's Watson Health, the sort of database they were trying to build all of these AI algorithms to predict health outcomes. It was not successful. And they just sold all that data to Meredith. And now Meredith has health information on about 80% of the US population. Anyway, so these databases are constantly changing hands in ways that it doesn't really matter what they promised you in the first place, or it doesn't really matter what the original terms and conditions said, because anytime they update the terms and conditions on their website, you're automatically agreeing to it. And all sorts of things are happening in this space. In terms of equity impact, so the things that I was talking about, Michigan Medicine specifically, as I mentioned, is true across institutions in the US, but also globally. This looks at genetic databases specifically and by genetic ancestry. But really, when we're talking about anybody other than Eurocentric or Asian ethnicity, anybody else, it's less than 4% representation, both globally and in the US is NHGRI, so that's our National Genetics Institute GWAS database, where we're doing what's basing most of our genetic-wide association studies, incredibly biased in terms of genetic ancestry, which might or might not be associated with self-identified race and ethnicity, but there is often an association between those two things. And there are implications for not being represented in these databases. These are implications for not being represented in genetic databases specifically, is that we have a much higher level of variants of unknown significance for populations that we don't have a lot of ancestry representation for. So for example, our Black patients are much more likely when we sequence their tumor to come back and we say, well, we don't know what that means in people of African ancestry. We know what this means for Ashkenazi Jewish women, or we know what this means for, different kinds of subcultures, but we don't really know what it means for you. There have been several reports of incorrect results or results that are totally non-applicable. So there's a famous Hawaii case with a drug that went on the market in Hawaii, and turns out it only targeted variants in people that was much more common in European ancestry, as opposed to Asian or Pacific ancestry, which a lot of the population in Hawaii is. So they're like, why would we even pay for this? And why would we let you advertise when it's sort of false advertising to our population? And when we don't have diversity, specifically ancestral diversity in genetic databases, that's just bad for everybody. Even if this doesn't call to your altruistic self to say we should be representing everybody, it's also bad for Europeans to not have this kind of ancestral diversity, because as we know, those with African ancestry are more likely to be diverse in terms of variance as to each other than Europeans are. And so as an example, people with African ancestry in one of our GWAS data sets, even though they are only 2.4% of our participants, actually represent 7% of the variants that we were able to associate with diseases or disorders, just because of that breadth of difference. So it's beneficial to everyone for people to be represented. Okay, so now I'm going to end with a couple of ideas of how to improve the system. This is a really big system. This is a really big problem, but just a couple of ideas. So one, this is starting sort of at the macro, at the institutional level, is that in the US, people who come in as research participants have a much higher level of protection than people who come in as patients. So the protections under HIPAA and the protections under our human subjects research regulations are different. And the reason that they're different, the sort of original ethical policy argument in support of that difference, was that, well, doctors are there to do good, and doctors are there to protect their patients. And so doctors are much less likely to have a conflict of interest than researchers, who are there only to promote themselves and only to do research that they want to do, and research participants need to be protected from researchers. This had a lot to do with the terrible history of experimentation and research on historically excluded populations in the US and abroad. But this sort of treating these two people differently, even though they could be the same person in the same appointment, just doesn't make any sense. And just because the regulations don't require us to act in protective ways doesn't mean we can't. And institutions can always go above and beyond what is required by the law to ensure at least that we're disclosing the same amount of information to our patients as we are to our research participants. And that's something we're working on implementing at the University of Michigan. So as I mentioned, we set up, in response to all of these calls by private industry to have access to our patient data and specimens, we set up an entire committee here where we review all these requests and ensure that everybody, if we're going to commercialize data, that we at least disclose that in the informed consent form, because there's some historical data that came in before we even knew to disclose potential commercialization, but we at least make sure it's that. There are a couple of exceptions, for example, in rare disease, but we review every single one of these applications, like a group of 15 people sit down and have like in-depth discussions once a week. And, it's not perfect, but that's at least our first step here. Journal standards. So journals can do a lot of work in this space. I don't know if any of you guys are editors-in-chief or associate editors of journals, but again, journals can set higher standards for what they'll publish than what is required by law. And in fact, so this is the example of PLOS Genetics saying we're only going to publish data from 23andMe and private genetic providers if they have IRB review. They're not required to get IRB review, remember, because they're commercial, so they're sort of outside that space, but we're going to require it in order for them to publish in our journal. And so now 23andMe has all of their research IRB reviewed, even though it's not required by law. And the last example I'll give of ways we can improve this system above and beyond just the baseline of what's required by law is that a lot of professional organizations in clinical care and in science are setting standards and building their own databases. So this is ASCO, so this is CancerLink that they set up for cancer practitioners. And my mentor, Dr. Reshma Jaxi, has done a lot of work with cancer patients, asking them about data sharing preferences in order to build this internal database in ways that reflect the values and priorities of cancer patients specifically. So that's sort of the final example I'll give of ways that we can improve the system without waiting for the wheels of government to very slowly turn. And with that, I will say thank you and open this up for discussion and questions.
Thanks very much, Kate. Wow, that's quite a span of the system you've gone through.
Yeah, sorry, I covered a lot, but it all works together in very complicated ways. So I think in order to understand why it's such a mess, you sort of have to understand all of the little pieces.
Yes. Anybody would like to ask any questions, pose some comments? Maybe while people are getting ready.
I'd also really be interested in people giving me feedback on how it might work similarly or differently in Canada. I would be really interested in having that conversation too. Looks like Nicole has a question or something.
Please, yes, Nicole, please, thank you.
I do. Yes. Hi. Thanks for your talk, Katie. It was really great. So one thing that we've actually kind of run into that was really interesting was the points you brought up around the private genetic databases and access by law enforcement, which actually is still happening here in Canada. There was actually just a case in Toronto where they arrested a man who had committed some pretty violent sexual assaults and murders in the 80s. And they identified him through a database through his brothers. So not even a direct genetic match, but a process of exclusion. So this is something
exactly what happened with us too. Yeah.
Yeah. So still a huge issue here. I guess my question is kind of like, how do we protect our participants' rights in doing this kind of work, especially if you're working with a population that potentially is more forensically involved or more likely to have a forensic history? So how do we kind of mesh those two worlds of working with vulnerable groups who may have a forensic history and connecting with these larger databases that potentially put them at risk?
Yeah, I mean, so I think the best answer to that is the hardest answer, which is that we can't guarantee the protection of their privacy when we're partnering with private industry, because private industry is allowed to change their terms and conditions and sell the data set to other people. And it's very ironic because often, so at least in the US population, as you know, our criminal justice system is incredibly racist and is much more likely to target Black and African American and Hispanic people for inclusion in our forensic and police databases, which is also descriptive of the historically excluded populations in research that we're trying to encourage to be included. So at least in the US, separate and apart from this recent issue where police are pretending to be like regular old people buying genetic tests, these databases are separate in the US, and people are generally very cautious about taking forensic data that would contribute, and like exchanging hands between law enforcement. It's weird because in the US, this is controlled by the states. This is like criminal law is a state issue. And so different states are different. So one of the reasons GED match, these officers got away with doing it is because they're in Florida. And so it got brought to a Florida court, and Florida was like, yeah, it's cool. You can't do that in Maryland, for example. Maryland just passed a law saying you can't actually do that. So it's going to be by state, which isn't the way that data work. Data cross state boundaries. So right now, what people in this space are doing is they're advocating state by state by state to have states pass laws like Maryland, where you can't share data between these databases. But that is a low and slow process. And I can tell you the states that are not going to care and the states that will right off the bat. So yeah, that's the problem with us, at least.
Great. Thanks for that.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you for the question, Nicole. Any other questions or comments? Anna, did you have anything you want to ask? Or?
Oh, thank you for the excellent presentation.
If we have one more minute and you don't have a question, can I bring up one more thing?
Please.
That I cut from my slides because I wanted to be cognizant of timing, but I think is really interesting, is this idea that I talked about a little bit about having what we call like a cognizable claim for injury if your data are used in ways that you don't like or you don't feel like you consented to. And our sort of test case for this was recent, and it was between the University of Chicago and Google. It was so a patient who went to the University of Chicago Medical Center for clinical care found out through, the newspaper or some sort of media that his data, so all this patient data, had been shared with Google in exchange for, so what Google was trying to do is Google was still trying to build the AI mechanisms and like train AI and machine learning devices for people's iPhones from all this patient data. And he sued University of Chicago and Google and said, I didn't consent to that. You didn't ask me. I don't want to do that. And there were lots of different things the court talked about, which were interesting. First of all, you're not allowed to sell identified patient data under HIPAA. That's prohibited. And the court did find that getting this licensing agreement, so University of Chicago was going to get a non-exclusive licensing agreement to the AI algorithms that Google was able to develop with their data. The court found that that was compensation, such that they were selling the data. So that's kind of interesting that that's set. But the other thing that happened was the court said, well, this patient didn't suffer any harm. Like there's nothing to pay him back for because one, people don't have a property interest in their health information, like the University of Chicago owns that health information. So I personally don't have a property interest in that health information. I can't write University of Chicago and say, delete my medical records. That's not the way it works. I don't have that right. And even if I did have a property interest in that medical information, it's not decreased in value by the University of Chicago sharing it with others. So it's not like a house that decreased in value because you're parking your abandoned car illegally on the front lawn, right? Like my interest in my health information, it's not less valuable to me just because it was shared. And so I think that was a dismissal. It was a small court in one state. So it's not going to have precedent across the US, but I think it's interesting in terms of informing how our court system will think of this. And again, it's all state law. And so unless and until the feds pass something, this is going to be up to the individual states and all of their courts. Wow. I guess does that make you guys feel better about your data sharing problems?
I must claim personal ignorance. I don't know. I don't know if there's somebody online who can, well, it's probably easily to be more informative than me, but please feel free to speak up. I know we, you know, we have like electronic health records, and then we have something I think which is unusual. In Ontario, there is an agreement between the Ontario Medical Association and the Ministry of Health to, and it's ICES, which is the Institute for Clinical Evaluative Sciences, and they seem to share an enormous amount of data of Ontario patients, an enormous amount of data. And the ICES do a lot of research with the data, and they do a lot of atlases as well. But I'm uninformed about whether we have similar problems. I think in general, what I would say is I think we're less litigious than in the United States. But I don't even know what laws there are there to protect for that. I think if somebody came to me and sort of asked about this, I would say you'll have to speak to sort of somebody with a very similar experience to you in our setup.
Yeah, I mean, I will say that I don't think it's, so I agree that Americans are probably more litigious, but I don't think that that's the problem here, because Americans, when you ask people about using commercial data and about contributing like very private health information to apps and stuff, people are actually very comfortable with that. And what they're uncomfortable with is researchers like me. Like they think I'm sketchy, but not like putting it on the iPhone. And I think it's because people don't fully understand, like I have all these rules that I have to follow and all these checks and balances, but like commercial data is totally unchecked, but people don't even realize that their data are actually, they input it and it's going right out their phone and shared with Facebook and all sorts of other places. And I have another talk about, repro specifically, because I'm in OB-GYN department, but about these period tracker apps and these fertility apps and sharing information as soon as it's input about sexual activity, about moods, just about all of these like very personal things with Facebook, so you can target advertising to people. Like, so if they're sad one day, you can say, hey, here's a weighted blanket, which can help with depression. Right. Or if they're feeling happy and they're like, yeah, like I'm fertile, like, let's go. They'll be like, here's a little black dress for your date. Right. And like you laugh, but it's true. And it's really frightening.
I don't even think.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's, if I put on my black dress, I'm going to have to shave quite a bit. Okay.
There's a product for that too, David.
Yeah, I bet. I don't even have a Facebook account, so I'm fine.
I just got rid of mine. Too much, too scary.
Yeah.
Well, thank you guys for having me. This was fun.
Yeah, I really appreciate it. And thank you for your time and wisdom. And it's much appreciated. I think people are quiet this morning, but I suspect that they got an awful lot out of it. So take care. Have a good rest of the day. And thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye, guys.
Take care. Bye-bye.